subscribers via.
Maybe you could add some lo-fi music just to attract more people.
I've been thinking if there's any way in which I can have sound effects in my presentation, I would love it. You know, the drums, the horns, machine gun fire. I would love to have fireworks. I would love to have sound effects and some background music, maybe to for like introduction song. If anyone knows how to have music play in Teams, I could have an introduction song. I would love that. All right, but in any case, dear students, let's talk. Good morning to all of you. Today I'm continuing my discussion of the French Revolution. So last time we talked about what the revolution was, why it happened. Then at the end I said, but why should you care, right? I talked about the kind of historical relevance of the French Revolution. And we talked about how it showed, already we talked a bit about how it showed that change was possible, that society is malleable, that we're not doomed to live under natural leaders or in some kind of natural state, but that we can simply change it if we come together, introducing new ideas of a republic, the idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the three values of the French Revolution. So that's one thing. Now we're going to move on to some other reasons. The second reason, dear students, why the French Revolution is so important historically is because it gave rise to the radical left. The radical left entered, let's say, the stage of world politics as a new faction. There's been radical left thinkers, some people would say Plato is there before, or Rousseau, although Rousseau is not a radical, but anyway, you had left thinkers before, but they never actually made a power play for it. They were just people writing books. Here they came with a whole new type of politics, that of revolutionary politics. This was a new vocabulary, let's say. It was entered into political thinking. You see, before this, you used to have revolutions between air marks, because things like the English Revolution or the Glorious Revolution or things like that, they were really what you would call house revolutions or coups. They were really one part the power replacing another part, or some outside force overthrowing a king. But they were not revolutions in the modern sense of the word. In the modern sense of the word introduced by the radical left, revolution is a break in how the country works, in which tomorrow is really different from yesterday, and that is achieved through an uprising of the people, through a direct participatory process. So revolution is not a coup. In a coup, you just kill the leader. In a revolution, large masses of people directly join the process, and it's this kind of collective transformation, and therefore profound transformation, because it involves so many more social relationships, let's say, that takes place, right? Like in the Mexican Revolution, it was not just, hey, they killed a guy and they took power. No, it was quite a long process involving hundreds of thousands of people who took part in the struggle, right? So the left introduces these revolutionary politics in which the people as a whole act in systemic change. And this whole idea of a revolution would change radically the meaning of what it is. Right before that, revolution would be a synonym for coup, while now it is a much bigger thing. Now, the ones leading this revolution, the case of France, were the Jacobins. We introduced them last time. They were the people who had most power in the new parliament, in the new commission. And the Jacobins, or Jacobinism, is the original radical left. But in fact, they are what the word left comes from. That's how you know original they are, right? The word left is is a direct reference to Jacobins, because the Jacobins would sit on the left side of Parliament, and that's where the left comes from. So they were not the first left in a spectrum sense people in history. For example, Rousseau was before them. However, they were the first ones to ever have actual power and to have elected power, right? Where the people said, we want this type of politics. I call them left again because the word is named after them, but it's important to remember that they existed before communism and socialism existed, right? That they were not a socialist or a communist party. These words actually didn't exist back then. So it's looking back at them, right? We have to keep that in mind. You cannot just equate them with any of these ideologies, but they're similar in the sense that if we look at, and they only had 4 years in power, right? But if we look at what they did, they placed a lot of emphasis on equality, legal equality, but also other types of equality. They placed a lot of emphasis on social transformation. They were progressives. For example, they legalized divorce. They placed a lot of emphasis on how society as a whole should change, how we should change living conditions of people, which is a traditionally left topic. And what also makes them left and what makes them socialist is that they saw the state as a tool to do this. So instead of just preaching morals to peoples, or instead of just changing a leader, or instead of using the state to just enforce laws, which is what the state had always been in the past 1,000 years, they saw the state as a means. They saw the state as, okay, we can use this state apparatus to educate people, to provide sanitation to people, to organize redistribution, to actually shape the conditions of the population. And that's what the left people in general always try to do. They try to use the state to improve the living conditions, to improve the human condition in a country, instead of just seeing the state as the law or as the police, right? Making it more active. And that's what the Jacobins also did. Now, Jacobins, the word Jacobin has a double connotation. It could be used just as a kind of a synonym for socialist, or it could be used as a synonym for violent revolutionary, because they were both. They were very notorious for seeing violence as a means to an end, right? They did try to eliminate the previous elite physically, right? In very dramatical fashion too, right? They didn't just, mostly if you assassinate people, you assassinate them in some back alley. They dragged them onto a podium in the middle of the marketplace, and then with a lot of drama chopped their head off. So it's a very, very visual display, a very spectacular display of violence. And they undeniably did that. They even built a whole new machine to do it, the guillotine. And then they come with this question in political science, already introduced by Machiavelli, but now from the left, if the ends justify the means. And this really accumulates in their leader. The leader of the Jacobins, at least for the most time, was Robespierre. And Robespierre is a very controversial figure in history, where on the one hand you could both see him as a hero or as a villain, and it's controversial to this day. There's a lot of debate in France about how he should be remembered. In the kind of American literature, I think the villain part has won, because the left must be demonized. But on the one hand, you could see him as quite a very aggressive person, and that went too far, and maybe that was a bit insane. Although I would not support that reading, but you could portray him as that, who went too far. Or you could also see him as a hero. I am closer to the second interpretation of the role of Robespierre in history, because I think we have to look at what he actually did. And what he decided to do, what he did with his power. And what he did with his power is he installed democracy. He brought back from 2,000 years the idea of universal suffrage. Well, Rousseau brought it back, but he actually did it, right? It's a lot easier to talk about it, but once you have all the power to then make yourself electable, that's quite a big step to do, right? You your presidency. But he did do that. The other thing he did many things, right? But just to name some progressive things he did, is he opened public office. So before that, if you want a position in government, you had to be connected to people, and not just knowing them. You had to be family of people that were already in power. For example, if you want to become a general, you couldn't become a soldier and then be a better soldier and then one day rise to that rank. That's not possible. You had to be you had to be family of aristocracy to even be considered for that job. He changed that. He said, okay, if you want to work in a hospital, if you want to work in the army, if you want to administer taxes, just apply, whoever you are, right? If you can read, okay, then send us your CV, let's say, right? And thus he opened up the state to everyone, because before that, it's not like it worked now. Like not everybody could be a state official. There was a protected profession. He changed that. And one of the most important things he did, what he never gets enough credit for, is that he abolished slavery. So France had a lot of colonies and therefore a lot of slaves at that point. And Robespierre thought, look, I'm being an enormous hypocrite if I'm preaching all this freedom and equality here, yet I'm funding this with the work of slaves over in the Caribbean, right, over in Southeast Asia. They're the ones who are making the money with which we're, of which I'm eating. That this is a bit hypocritical of me to have slaves or to allow slavery if I'm the guy for equality. So he said, I'm going to abolish slavery. And the entire elite said, no, please don't do it. You're crazy. You're going to lose all this power. But he did it. He gave the order. He said simply release the slaves. So millions and millions and millions of people got their freedom, literal freedom, not in philosophical sense, thanks to Robespierre. So that's a bit the thing here, right? Where he falls. We're going to come back to this question of how violent were they really later on. But first I must complete this part. So, what else? There's a third reason why you should be interested in the French Revolution, and that's for the consequences, for the ripple effects on the rest of the world. One of the most important things that happened with the French Revolution, and that was not that people at the moment didn't realize was happening, but to people after the French Revolution, like Marx, like Hegel, it was very clear that this is what happened, is that it introduced, let's say, the final victory of capitalism, or the first true victory of the capitalist class. What it really did, if you look at like the long-term effects of it, is that it replaced the feudal ruling class, nobility and the church, with the capitalist class. Because nobility was dead, right? The head got chopped off. So once democracy was over, there was space for a new elite, and the capitalist class took that space. So you could see the French Revolution as a fight between the people and the elite, but that's not really what happened, at least not if you zoom out. What really happened is that part of the elite, the bourgeoisie, was able to enrage the people enough so they would take up arms against the other elite and kill them. And then once that was done, right, out of that grew democracy, and out of that grew the Jacobins, but the Jacobins got killed. Robespierre got shanked. They stabbed him on his desk. The conservatives did that. So once the revolution was done and the people were taking power, the bourgeoisie was like, oh no, we're not going to have these people in charge now. We can't have that. What the hell? They're releasing the slaves. So they killed him, and they killed most of his friends too. So they kind of aborted their own revolution, and what was left standing after the dust cleared is that feudalism was abolished, the nobility was dead, and so the capitalist class was able to take all power. They didn't keep democracy. They didn't really change how the economy worked, or at least they didn't change it in favor of the people. They just got rid of some really irrational elements, like having a king that's simply spending all the money on his garden, literally on his garden or on his palace, right? They got rid of the most insane parts of the old regime. But they did consolidate their power, and that's very important because this class is going to drive history until today, right? Another thing that is a consequence or a ripple effect of the French Revolution is that it was the start of decolonization. So it showed other countries that were colonies, that change was possible. It showed them that you can overthrow a European power, because European powers are fighting each other. And if their people can do an uprising against them, then us, who are way more exploited than them and way further away from their capital, maybe we can do an uprising too. This coincided with the American Revolution, which was much less spectacular, but a bit earlier actually, right? And the United States becoming independent. Those two things combined, the French and the American Revolution combined, kind of signaled the start of decolonization. It would be a very slow process, right? Only would be completed after World War II. But a lot of countries took inspiration from this. One example of this is Haiti. So when Robespierre released the slaves, one of the reasons why all conservatives were against this is because they were scared that the slaves would not take this kindly. Robespierre thought, if I release them, they're going to be thankful and just, walk into the sunset. But that is not what happened. What happened is in Haiti, when he released them, they got angry because of how they were treated for all these years. So they actually took up arms once they were free and tried to have their own French Revolution, have their Haitian Revolution, and just kick the French out altogether, which is what they did. They had their violent uprising of slaves, ex-slaves against ex-owners, and the slaves won in this fight, and they kicked them out or killed them, and that's when Haiti became independent. It's one of the first countries to become independent in the Caribbean, probably the first that I know of. So that's all a direct consequence of the French Revolution. And last thing, very briefly, right? One thing this also changed, which will have consequences later on, is it changed war. Before this, war was about personal issues between leaders or ideas of leaders, like we must liberate Jerusalem, or you stole my wife, I'm gonna kill you now, or things like that. But here, with the French Revolution, war was of one system against the other, right? It was of republics against kingdoms. So the stakes were much higher. They were not just coming to replace the leader, they were coming to conquer how a society worked. So the amount of resources that went to war, the scale of the armies was much bigger than ever before. Napoleon came with these first time absolutely mass scale battles, and that would raise the stakes and raise competitions in the coming centuries between countries. All right, do you have any questions about any of this, students, before I move on? Nobody's awake. You're all having breakfast. It's literally true.
Well, I don't have any questions.
Okay. All right. I'll pretend you're actually here, and I'm not just talking to an empty void, and enthusiastically keep talking. So, dear students, that's the French Revolution. With this topic, right, I talked a bit about political violence, and we're going to see a lot of political violence in the next classes too. Well, not literally the next class, but in the future. And I want to take this opportunity and take this topic as a starting point to have a discussion with you, an actual discussion about violence. Because I think it's a subject that's a nice thing to explicitly discuss, because there's some depth to it. Here you can see this is from, I think, March, some protests where feminists were attacking a police station, I think, right? Because we have a lot of this discussion of do the ends justify the means, right? This is a really relevant discussion, kind of eternal discussion. Ms. Arnett.
Doctor, how do you say it was called the war of the slaves?
Is the Haitian Revolution.
Thank you.
So if you Google Haiti Revolution or slave revolution, then Wikipedia will probably show you a nice article about that. So violence. Violence in its broadest definition, right, to just be a sensible, intelligible word, has to do with inflicting harm on others, right? Using force that somehow inflicts harm on others. Yet when I say the word violence, if I would shout violence, the first thing you're going to think of is physical aggression, right? That's the most common or the most direct understanding of the word violence is punching, stabbing, shooting, right? That's violence. That's the core meaning of the word and our first association with it. And we have a certain fascination with violence in this sense. We're kind of biologically trained to respond to it. It triggers adrenaline in us, usually out of anger, but maybe some people enjoy it even. It is inherently fascinating or horrifying. You cannot stop looking if you would see a fight, and it's very easy to understand, right? Physical aggression. It's very easy to understand what happens if somebody shoots another person. So it is the type of violence that we think about most, and I would say are a little bit obsessed with in Western culture. The problem with that is with always looking at violence as physical aggression, right? This is punching the other person, is that obscures other types of violence that are very relevant to include and to have a real discussion about how violent something really is. The most important of those other types of violence is structural violence. And I want to talk to you a bit about structural violence. So structural violence is when the structure of society, right, inflicts harm on people. So structural violence means that the organization of society, or that society is organized in a way that predictably will cause harm on other people. So you know, if you can think, you know that, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to organize ourselves like this, if we're going to accept this system, then that will have outcomes that are going to kill people. That could be, for example, structural violence could be an economic system. Colonialism is inherently violent, right? Or a slave society is inherently violent because it will very predictably lead to harm being inflicted on large groups of people and excess debt on those people. Just like brutal capitalism is predictably violent. It is very predictable if you have a society like early capitalism, 18th, 19th century, where you have no labor rights whatsoever, where people have no contracts. Every day again, you need to find your job, and where they pay you just enough to stay alive. It is very predictable that this system is going to kill people, it's going to harm people, and it's going to reduce the state of humanity, right? So a certain economical system could be violent, but you could also see certain political acts as structural violence, right? Certain rules can predictably set people up for harm. If I if I make a rule where I outlaw something that is very normal, but it now make it criminally punishable, right? Let's say I make a rule that you would be executed for stealing. Stealing is partly a consequence of other things in society. Quite predictably going to lead to a lot of people dying. If I would make using soft drugs punishable by death, then that is going to lead to violence. Or let's take a better example here, because there's still physical aggression, right? Let's say that Trump would completely, he already tried to do it, but let's say he completely abolishes public health care. Right, let's say he signs a law, he says, oh, with COVID it became too expensive for the government. We're just going to scratch, or we're going to cut Medicaid completely. Him doing that physically is not a violent act. He's signing a paper, he's touching no one. Yet by him doing that, he would predictably kill. Or he would not kill them, he would set in motion a chain of events that will kill hundreds of thousands of people, right? So that is structural violence. It could also be, structural violence could be the exclusion of people from certain resources they need. If we have a city that's built around a lake, let's say a community, right, that lives on the lake and in a desert, and I buy that lake and I build a fence around it, right? I'm not touching anyone, I'm not using any force, I'm just depriving you of your only resource. I'm excluding you from that, and you predictably will die of thirst, right? But I didn't do that to you. I didn't touch you, right? There was no physical aggression involved in this. So all these things are structural violence, and why this is important is that structural violence kills a lot more people than aggression does. Because of our bad historians will focus on aggression. They write about wars, and they will write about, people smashing each other's head in with an axe, while the real killing is not happening there. And I can prove that to you. I'm going to show you a graph, dear students. I want you to pay real attention to my next slide, because it should change your life. It should, not your life, not like you're going to become rich, but it should change the way you see the world. If you believe, remember with John Locke, he had this quote, about once he saw that his ideas were wrong, he was going to throw them in the fire. This is one of those moments, right? Either you take in what I'm going to show you and you will learn, or you don't. This graph comes from Thomas Porre, who's a poverty scholar, and he made this for the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the United Nations. So this is not just nobody, right? There's not some fool on Reddit or Twitter. This is the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And what it shows you is millions of deaths. And it shows you various violent events. You have the Korean Wars, you have colonial violence in Congo, that's on us, on Belgium. You have the Russian Civil War, you have World War I, super violent event, right? You have a bunch of things, right? So let's be bad historians, right? And say that everybody who died under Mao is his fault of communism. Let's say everything that happened under Stalin is also the fault of communism. And let's even say that the Russian Civil War is also the fault of communism, although there was a war against communism. Let's count all those deaths under communism. You would get to 59 million people, right? That would have died here. And let's say that World War II, this is a low estimation. I would have it at 70 million, but okay. Let's say that World War II, let's say that's all the Nazis' fault, right? Although a lot of it was a war against the Nazis. Let's say all of this is Hitler's fault. So 60 million each. That's horrific. This is very bad. That is terrible. But now let's compare it to the first thing you see. This is worldwide poverty deaths. People basically died of hunger due to lack of money, or they couldn't have medical care because of money. Between 1990 and 2013. Why 1990? That's not an arbitrary number. 1990 is the end of communism. So all these people died outside communism. They died in capitalist countries. That's what this means, right? So in just 23 years of capitalism, 416 million people died of preventable causes without any aggression being inflicted on them. right? This is structural violence. As you can see, structural violence is over 6 times more than the World War, than all people who died under communism combined, of structural violence themselves, right? So this should get you thinking about where the real violence is. And that doesn't mean that the violence of World War I wasn't horrific. It was terrible. It's one of the worst things that ever happened to humanity. But with being obsessed with aggression, we kind of miss, the real graveyards of this world. And that's what I want you to remember from this graph. If you can understand its meaning. Marcella asked if you could outsource that to. No, it looks that way because these people are in my calculation, right? So I'm in favor of just looking at death rates if you talk about violence. It's a bit distracting to look at the punching and the pulling. I think we should look at graveyards to decide what's violent and what's not. Well, they're all violent, right? But so let's talk about that a bit more. I'm running out of time, unfortunately, but so structural violence is a thing. I just demonstrated that, but you could expand that further, right? Because I'm still talking about people dying at the end of the day. We could, in a postmodern sense, talk about violence much more broadly. You could talk about psychological violence, confronting somebody with their worst fears, for example, right? Or doing things that will destabilize their mental peace. You could talk about verbal violence, insulting people. You could talk about symbolic violence. That's a sociological concept. So symbolic violence is what girls do to each other. Symbolic violence is if you use your status, your power, to destroy the status of another person, right? So if boys fight, they're gonna punch each other. If girls fight, they're gonna spread nasty gossip about each other, right? Or like sharing a nude picture of someone else. That's symbolic violence because you make them look like a slut, and that's gonna destroy their reputation, and that that will decrease the respect they get. So that's symbolic violence. So the debate here is this really violence? You could say that these are different forms of violence, right? And that we talk about it too narrow-mindedly, and that all of these things could somehow be linked to harm. Or you could say that they're overstatements. You could say that we've gone too far in this generation in seeing things that don't actually physically hurt you as violent. And thereby we're eroding the meaning of violence, right? We become kind of insensitive to it, and now everything is violence. What do you think about this? That's a question. That's not a rhetorical question. I'm asking you, actually. Hello?
Can you repeat the question, please?
So my question, if you think that things like psychological, verbal violence exist, do you think that this is violence or not? We're talking about the definition of violence. Do you think it's an overstatement to call them violence, or you think that this really is violence?
No, I think it is. Sometimes it can be worse than physical violence because it can cause like trauma, PTSD. I don't know if they're the same, but it can cause more bad effects than physical ones. And I don't know, I think society doesn't acknowledge those verbal and mental violence enough, even that they know sometimes what happens.
Mm-hmm. Any other opinions on this?
I think you can't see the hands that are raised.
Okay.
Yeah, but I was gonna say kind of the same thing as Yareli, but also that I think maybe society, I guess, in general is a bit right in pointing out that like young people now think everything is violence, they can't take anything, because I do think in part is true, but I think it's important to highlight the little things, because at the end of the day, if we shed light on, I guess, small issues that normally we wouldn't care about, or we would ignore, we would dismiss, then as time goes on, they will stop being so little or so insignificant. I don't know if I'm explaining my point. Like
Mm-hmm.
perhaps there is some truth in both sides, as in, okay, yeah, maybe it is um not that big of an issue if I look at a girl in the hall and she feels bad. Like maybe I shouldn't like be expelled or something like that. But it is true that I am doing something that is mean, and at the end of the day, if it hurts her, then it did hurt her. Like you cannot deny that either. Um so yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see different people commenting. Thank you for that. Susanna, you want to say something?
Yes, I was thinking that they are uh, linked to real violence because I believe that it's good to differentiate between psychological or verbal violence and physical violence, but we must know that those two also can be connected. Like psychological violence um, can be displayed at the same time as physical violence. So I believe that violence in general is like uh, I don't know, agredir, like hurt, harm somebody, and there's different and there's different like ramifications of this violence. Like violence is just the thought of harming someone, and physical violence and psychological violence are just two different types of ways of harming someone that could be displayed at the same time, or that could be displayed in different and separated times. And that's it.
Okay,
Thank you.
Good. So you guys seem to have quite progressive opinions on this. That's interesting. I'm in the middle of it. I've kind of problems with the idea of verbal violence. I think I have a hard time seeing how insulting people harms them unless they want to be harmed. Unless it is psychological violence, right? If it's bullying and I see you every day and I insult you every day, I think that becomes a different thing. But I did notice that students also consider insults as violence. Okay. So, other question or other kind of discussion with violence is when violence is wrong, right? I wish we had more time. Well, we have more time. We're going to keep talking. I'll be here, but wait a sec. Will you ask us an example of verbal violence? Yeah, my problem is just like if verbal violence either is just an insult that hurts your ego, which I don't think we should consider as hurt, or as if it really affects you, it becomes something else. It would be symbolic of violence, right? If racial slurs then have effects on your life because people are going to start treating you different, then that, then it becomes kind of a different thing. But anyway, what I was going to say is that if we say that violence is bad, or if we think about what's bad about violence, there's again two stances you could have. You could say that violence is bad in principle, that the use of force is inherently evil, that's what evil is, that evil is harm. So that's the pacifist position, right? Or you could have the other position, that is that violence is only evil in its consequence. The use of force in itself is not bad. If you kill somebody with it, it is bad. If you harm somebody with it, this is bad. So to give you, like to make you understand what the difference is, if you believe the first thing, you would be against boxing or against any combat sport, because the use of violence in itself, the punch in itself, is evil. While if you don't have that opinion, you would be okay with things like the UFC because they know what they're doing, and the people don't take it as harm because they choose to fight. It's only bad if somebody would kill another person in there. I think not all, but I think most people would be on the consequence side of this debate. I am, for example, but I'm just telling you of the other position. And if you do think it's bad depending on the consequence, right? Then when would violence be justified? Is it bad or good? I think you have two options here. This really matters also for understanding politics and history, but you could either motivate violence based on a need. If you say it is not principally evil, then either violence is bad unless it is necessary. So that would mean that, for example, to free slaves, let's say you need to assassinate one person to free the slaves. Then you would say, okay, we tried other means. We asked them politely, they didn't do it. We did protest, they didn't do it. So now what we need to do is to kill this person to free the slaves, right? In that case, the necessity of the violence would justify the violence. So if you use violence when it's not necessary, it's evil. When you use violence, there's a quote of Fidel Castro, he said, using violence without ethical purpose is evil, as is not using violence when it's ethically necessary. So that's one stance. The other stance is that violence would be permitted based on motive, if it's morally justified. So that would mean that's, for example, committing violence out of revenge, or out of a feeling of justice, or against bad people, right? Let's say rapists. You don't need to do this because you already got them. But if you then want to hurt them even more, that's out of a kind of a moral feeling that you should do that. I'm going to keep talking and ask you later what you think about. You can type it in the chat what your feelings on this are, right? I just want to point out that the second one is very dangerous historically, because most big killings happened with one side feeling morally justified and feeling like the people they were killing were evil or out of revenge, etc. It's a very common motive there. So these are just some questions I want you to think about. But to stay within my time limit, I'm going to go to my last slide. But please, I want to know your opinion. Please type it on if you think violence is bad in principle or only in consequence, and then what exactly that means to you. So I wanted to come back to the French Revolution and tie it all together and come back to politics and change, right? In the case of the Jacobins, if we judge them, we have to really understand the full picture here. Yes, they kind of committed genocide against the elite, right? But we have to know that if you would look at absolute death rates, right, on graveyard occupation rates, more people died before the French Revolution than during the French Revolution. Because the king was also killing people. Lots of people got hanged and executed just somewhere in the prison, right? Not publicly. And they got executed for stealing, for doing, these type of small crimes. So if you would just look at numbers, you could ask what's worse, killing as in the French Revolution, or keeping the peace, keeping the system, not having the revolution, thereby killing many more people. Because statistically, less people died by the revolution than by not having the revolution. And that's a kind of paradox that I want to open your mind to, that we have to consider. I'm not pro-violence, but to consider the full picture when you talk about historical events, right? Because if we just focus on the aggression part of it, systems are very good at hiding the people they're really killing, and then hiding, graveyards and mass graves. So it's very important what catches the attention in something, right? So that would be my argument for Jacobins and for the justification of the French Revolution. They probably saved much more lives than they costed. Pacifists, though, there's a counter argument to this, right? although I would be on this side of the debate, there is another side of very respectable people, people like Gandhi, people like Martin Luther King, true heroes. They would say, no, this is not a justification for violence, because you never know if you really needed to kill people for that, right? You could have, for example, just imprisoned the old elite. Jacobins would say no, they would break them out of prison, then they would turn against us, and you would have a counter-revolution, which happened. But you could say from a president's point of view, no, but you don't know that. You could have just exiled them all to Haiti. Or you could just have mass protests, and you do have revolutions, and you do have changes in countries that happened without too much violence, or with very minimal violence, right? Just people demanding change in itself could change it. Plus, violence makes it kind of worse, because once you have violence, it distracts, because violence fascinates. It distracts from what you're trying to say. It delegitimizes your movement, right? Now you set in chain motion, in the case of French Revolution, you said because you killed them, you triggered a lot of wars with other countries because their family got angry, and that kind of derailed the whole revolution and caused its downfall. You could also say that, right? So you could say that non-violence is maybe more radical because it would be more permanent. Which again, to which a counterpoint is, yeah, but probably not going to happen, right? So these are the two sides in this debate. You could justify violence if you look at the bigger picture, and if you save more people than you would kill, you could make it a hard ethical point for that. Or you could point out that you cannot be certain of that, and that you're setting in motion events that might lead to more deaths in the long run. Because if you count all the wars that this triggered, right, you could say that. Miss Annette, sorry. I saw an R that didn't exist.
Yes, teacher. I had like an issue when you say that it could be morally like justified, but I have a question. How or in like what position do you have to be to say that it is morally justified that you can kill people? I mean, how would you say like morally it's good or it's bad when you kill people because you're gonna like save more? But I don't know. It just like I don't. It caused me an issue because I feel like okay.
I
don't
think,
know. It's weird.
well, Mr. Net, let me, okay, I don't, like, I want to really pose as an open discussion, right? Because I want to give you both sides. And again, the pacifist people are really smart people, right? And they're, like Martin Luther King is one of, I think, the best political actors in world history. But to answer your question, let me give you a simple thought experiment, right? Let's say you had dinner with the chief executioner of let's say you were on a date with the main enforcer of the Jalisco cartel. And he's talking about his next move. He's going to kill 500 people. He has them in prison. He says like, okay, we're going to get rid of these prisoners. I'm going to torture them to death. Okay. So this is going to happen. This person is going to do that right after dinner. You have a little pill of poison in your purse, and he goes to the washroom. You could save 500 lives if you slip that pill into his drink and call the police so they would free these people, right? Wouldn't you agree that in that case, violence is justified? Maybe you say no to that, but this would be a thought experiment I would offer you to try to understand the logic behind what I'm saying. I would try to kill him if I was in that scenario, but that's a moral issue. So there's no permanent proof of any position, right? That's why it's ethics. But I would feel justified in killing this person. But it's not a legal question. So now but we're talking about extreme things, right? I'm gonna go over my time, so you can leave if you want to. I'm just gonna keep talking. Because I want to talk a little bit about protests. Or do you have to go? You tell me.
Personally, I want to stay.
Okay, well, you can decide for yourself, right? The big discussion that we have in the last year, right, has to do with protests and the feminist protests, for example, and if these are the right means for it, etc., etc., etc. And I want to comment on protest in a very general sense. So you have the different takes on it, and I'm talking from as a political actor here. I think you have to consider multiple things here. On the one hand, violence does delegitimize, and if you use violence when you don't need to use it, of any type, you are losing the argument because the media will cover that, right? And you can try to throw that back and say the police was violent, but you know, they're mostly reacting, right? In any images I've seen, the police reacts to violence. So you could say it's strategically a mistake because and I've been in much bigger protests in Belgium that went with 200,000 people. That went really well until somebody, my cousin, started throwing rocks at the police, and then it all went to hell. And you know, you can say that. But on the other hand, that's if you do it without a need. A protest, right? If you talk about means and if these are correct ways, sometimes I get the impression that people, when they talk about, oh, are these the correct ways? What they want is a protest that just doesn't disturb at all, right? They're like, oh, but do you need to bother people with your things? Yes, you need to bother people. A protest is not going to be effective unless it disturbs normality. If people tell you you cannot disturb normality in your protest, they're basically telling you not to protest. A protest that doesn't disturb, doesn't catch attention, therefore doesn't exist. You won't get media coverage. You will not. No, if people can just ignore you, they will ignore you because they have a reason why they disagreed with you in the first place, right? So if you don't disturb normality, your protest is not happening, even in a sense. It's just happening in your mind. You're expressing your opinion and you feel good about it with your friends. But politically speaking, it didn't happen. So the trick here is to find a way to disturb without visible violence. So for example, one way of doing this, what AMLO did back when he was the opposition, he and Morena people, back then PRD, they would simply sit down on the highway. So he would block the main avenue of Mexico City. That is super disturbing, right? That disturbs 20 million people. But it's not violent, right? So you can't blame them for violence because they didn't touch no one. So I think I think it's important to have a very nuanced discussion about this, where you talk about limits of violence. On the other hand, you have to understand that protesters cannot just stand somewhere because they will be ignored. So it's more of a question of what do you need to do to reach a certain effect, and you can do more than you need to do, and then you would be in the wrong, or you could be do less, and therefore it will not work. So I think that's an interesting debate here, right? And you could also point out that different rules apply to different people. Different groups get way more attention than other groups, and some groups will just disappear, their opponents, right? Or some people, for example, very powerful people don't need to protest. Right? They try it now with Frenna, but it's kind of clowning. But and they just pull strings, right? They will be heard. If Carlos Slim wants something, he will make sure people will know he wants it. He doesn't need to do this drama. So that's just some things I want to ask here. There's a theory, a menaced possible utilitarianism. There would be a utilitarian explanation of violence, yeah. So do you have any comments on what I just said? What do you think?
I think there is little to no moral in killing somebody, but sometimes it's necessary. Like, for example, in the thing you said about violence and about protesting, yes, there's some protests that, but well, I think that protests need to be uncomfortable for people in order to be heard, because people just don't listen to the things that they don't bother them. So that's my opinion.
Mhm. So Vivek, I'm not saying violence is good, right? I'm not saying that. I'm giving context to the French Revolution, and how you judge people. Like you can judge somebody for killing the king, not taking into account that the king killed 10 times more people. Okay, well, I just want to start this discussion, right? I don't have any strong opinions on any of this, just to get you thinking. So with that, I end this here, and tomorrow we move on. All right?
Okay, teacher.
All right. So, happy Monday.
Teacher, have a good day.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.